I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Lawrence Gray. He is an accomplished machine learning expert with expertise in accounting and geospatial intelligence. He earned his PhD in cellular and molecular physiology from Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. He's currently the director of engineering at Kung Fu AI. And here at Georgetown University, he is a program director and instructor in data analytics and data-driven decision-making. He's also a subject matter expert, a great friend, and really an accomplished professional. Dr. Gray, it is so great to have you with us today. Thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Well, Jeff, thank you for such a kind introduction. But today, what I want to do is just have a conversation with everyone about something that's been on my mind as of late for the past couple of months when I was asked to do this talk, and it's bias in data analysis. So what I want for us to do is just kind of face it that we're all human, and that means we're prone to biases that cloud our judgment and lead us astray. But when it comes to data analysis, these biases have serious consequences affecting the validity of our conclusions and the quality of our decision-making. So in this talk, we're going to dive deep into the world of cognitive and statistical biases and exploring how they can distort our understanding of reality, and more importantly, what we can do to overcome them. So from confirmation biases, which we will talk about, where we seek out evidence that supports our pre-existing beliefs while ignoring contradictory information, to sample biases, where our conclusions are based on unrepresentative data. So these biases can be sneaky and pervasive, but fear not, with awareness, determination, and the right tools, we can navigate through the treacherous waters of bias and arrive at the shores of truth. So buckle up and join us on this journey as we uncover the ins and outs of cognitive and statistical biases. We're going to learn from real-world examples of their impact and discover the strategies we can use to avoid falling into the traps. So together, let's build a better, more objective understanding of the world around us. Again, as humans, we're naturally subjective, and that can impact our judgment in many ways. So there's a quote on your screen by Harry Haran Kolam, which really sums up everything. And he says, avoiding bias starts by recognizing that data biases exist both in the data itself and in the people analyzing or using it. So let's unpack these two categories of biases. So we're only going to focus on cognitive and statistical biases. For cognitive biases are like those little quirks in our thinking that can trip us up when we're analyzing data. Cognitive biases have been identified and used in numerous social psychology and behavioral economics research as it impacts people's decision-making in their day-to-day lives, including data analytics work. For statistical biases, these are mostly technical fallacies we fall into unconsciously when we're doing analysis. So as far as it goes, so cognitive biases can be broken down, and we're only going to talk about two here, which are confirmation biases and reporting biases. And then for statistical, we're going to look at measurement bias, sample bias, and selection bias. So let's focus in on cognitive. So we said cognitive bias is made up in what I'm going to present here is confirmation bias and reporting bias. So let's look at some examples and talk through what confirmation bias is. So when you have a hunch about something and you can only pay attention to the information that confirms it while ignoring anything that contradicts it, that's confirmation bias. And let me tell you, it really, really messes with your data analysis. So this type of biases can be particularly problematic in data analysis because it can lead to incorrect or misleading conclusions. It can also prevent researchers from considering alternative explanations and approaches. I myself have been prone to confirmation bias in my academic research, where I truly wanted something to be explained one way and ignored the fact that the real answer or the real reason for my for the results that I was receiving were something even more spectacular. And it took a while for me to get to that conclusion because I just wanted to confirm my own thoughts. But for another example is if we have an analyst that believes a particular marketing campaign is effective, they may only look for data that confirms this belief, such as positive feedback from customers or increased sales. However, they may ignore or downplay other factors that could be contributing to the positive outcomes, such as seasonal trends or external economic factors. On the screen now, what we're looking at is a situation where we have a restaurant owner that might go through reviews and pull out all the positive reviews. So here's the positive review that the restaurant owner actually pulled out. And for him, he was really focused on just looking at the positive results. The owner might ignore negative feedback and overall comes to an incomplete conclusion. And we can see here that the overall, his restaurant was doing pretty terrible. And that we can look at these one-star reviews that were coming out that basically people did not like the food and other things, or finding things inside the food, and those types of things. And if you looked at the overall ranking of the restaurant, you can see that most people ranked it as terrible. So to avoid confirmation bias, it's important for you and me, our analysts, to approach data analysis with an open mind and willingness to consider all available evidence, even if it contradicts our pre-existing beliefs. This can involve seeking out diverse perspectives, testing multiple hypotheses, and using rigorous statistical models to ensure that the findings are valid, not only valid, but also reliable. So let's get into some real world examples. But before I do that, just to kind of make a point that we all have confirmation biases, I'm going to tell you about a study that was published in a journal of public health. And I recently came across this research study. What it showed was how confirmation bias affects people's views on vaccines. So the study found that people tend to misinterpret evidence about vaccines in ways that reflect their underlying beliefs. It's a reminder that we need to be aware of confirmation bias when communicating, especially in this case about vaccines or any other topic. So what ended up happening in this study, people made systematic errors when evaluating evidence that was inconsistent with their prior beliefs. So the pattern emerged among people with both pro-vaccination and anti-vaccination attitudes. And the errors were attributed to confirmation bias because no such differences were detected when participants evaluated data unrelated to vaccines. So in day-to-day life, the way that we view things, we have our own personal biases that can affect the way that we interpret evidence, as seen in this study, which I thought was very, very interesting. So let's get into some real life examples. So the story about the restaurant owner was fictional, just to give you an example of what confirmation bias kind of looks at. Then I overlaid that with the actual study, research study, where it shows that people can have confirmation bias when they're evaluating the same piece of evidence, and their evaluation was a result of their preconceived beliefs. So a real example of this confirmation bias, hopefully this didn't happen not too long ago, but remember the story of Elizabeth Holmes and her company, Theranos. So Holmes founded Theranos in 2003 with the goal of revolutionizing blood testing by using a single drop of blood instead of the traditional venous draws. So despite a lack of scientific evidence and repeated expert warnings, Holmes continued to promote the technology and raise millions of dollars in investment. She also recruited a team of high-profile advisors, including former government officials, military leaders, who were all swayed by her charismatic personality and her vision for disruptive new technology. However, the truth about Theranos eventually emerged, and it was revealed by the company's that the company's technology did not work as advertised. Holmes and her partner, Sunny Balwani, were indicted on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy just in 2018. So this case here is a clear example of confirmation bias, as Holmes and her team ignored or downplayed evidence that contradicted their pre-existing beliefs about the efficacy of their technology. And they also surrounded themselves with like-minded individuals who reinforced their beliefs and failed to question the validity of the technology. So we're going to switch gears here. And so we talked about confirmation bias. Let's move on to looking at the other cognitive bias, which is reporting bias. And in my talk today, we're going to talk a lot about pharmaceutical companies. Not that I just wanted to pick on them particularly, but they provide great examples of these types of biases that are occurring and that have huge impacts on people's lives. So let's talk about reporting bias. So reporting bias happens when certain outcomes, results, or data points are more likely to be reported, published, and emphasized compared to others, often because of factors unrelated to the true underlying reality or significance of the information, right? This can lead to a skewed perception of the facts or a misrepresentation of the truth. So how many of you have heard of the Vioxx scandal? So this is a real-world example of reporting bias involving the drug Vioxx, which was developed by a pharmaceutical company called Merck in the late 1990s. And it was used as a pain reliever and an anti-inflammatory medication. However, in 2004, the drug was withdrawn from the market due to concerns about its safety, as studies had linked it to increased risks of heart attacks and strokes. However, it was later discovered that Merck had engaged in reporting bias by selectively reporting and downplaying negative findings about the drug's safety. Specifically, internal documents from Merck showed that the company had manipulated data and withheld information from clinical trials that indicated a higher risk of heart problems for patients taking the drug. This allowed Merck to present a more favorable picture of the drug's safety to the regulators and to the public. Right? So the case of Vioxx highlights the serious consequences of reporting biases in the pharmaceutical industry, as it can lead to patients being prescribed drugs that are not as safe or effective as they appear. It also underscores the importance of transparency and accountability in clinical research and drug development. So we're going to look at another example of reporting bias with another drug. And this reporting bias occurred in a study on the effectiveness of this drug, Tamiflu. And Tamiflu was used to treat influenza. So the study conducted by the drug manufacturer Roche was used to support the drug's approval by regulatory agencies and its widespread use in treating flu outbreaks. However, it was later discovered that the study results were selectively reported and misrepresented by Roche, with negative findings about the drug's effectiveness being downplayed or omitted altogether. So what this ended up leading to is this distorted understanding of the drug's benefits and risks, and raised questions about the ethics of pharmaceutical companies conducting and reporting on their own research. So the reporting bias in this case was eventually exposed by independent researchers and investigative journalists, leading to a greater transparency and scrutiny in the drug approval process. However, it also highlights the importance of independent verification and critical analysis of research findings, especially when they are being used to inform important policy decisions. So we're going to switch gears now, and we're going to look at statistical biases. And I will go a little bit more detail with these because we generally don't think about statistical biases in our day-to-day life, but they're being used, these biases are being used all the time. And we just sometimes are not aware of them. So I will give you examples of this. So for statistical biases, as with cognitive biases, it can sneak up on you in many ways. Both like biases overall can get our thinking. So we think about cognitive biases, and then the actual data analysis, which you were thinking more statistical biases. So let's break down like statistical biases. So again, we stated that statistical biases are mostly the technical fallacy we fall into unconsciously when doing data analysis, right? And so the types of statistical biases we mentioned before were measurement biases, sample biases, and selection bias. So these are the main flavors of it. There's other bias that is associated with statistical, but I'm only going to touch on these three. So measurement bias happens when, so we're going to focus on measurement bias on this slide. So measurement bias happens when our data doesn't really match up with the truth. It's like trying to get an accurate weight with a broken scale. And so measurement bias can come in all sorts of places. So measurement bias, and just to let you know, is also, if you heard it differently, it's called observation bias also, or information bias. And so in all of this, it's just the systematic error that occurs when data is collected or recorded in a study, in which that the true values are not what are really being recorded. And this discrepancy can lead to inaccurate or misleading conclusions about the relationships between variables or the effectiveness of interventions. So where do measurement biases come from? There are instrument biases, like I mentioned, the scale being off. So these are instrument biases are when our tools are off or not quite right for the job. There's observer bias. Sometimes we humans can't help but sneak in our own thoughts and expectations in the mix. So you can have those observer bias. Recall bias is when if we're asking people to remember stuff, they might not get it 100% right. And then finally, measurement bias. Another factor is response bias. And this is when our participants might not always be totally honest or accurate in their answers. So these are all, these four: instrument bias, observer bias, recall bias, and response bias are all what make up various factors for measurement bias. So in order to minimize measurement bias, people just need to carefully design, be more careful in their design and implementation of their studies, making sure that they have accurate and reliable measurement tools. They have people that are properly trained to collect the data, and they're implementing strategies such as in most research studies, there will be blinding, like people don't know who has or has not have the correct treatment or who received the placebo. And there's actual randomization occurring also. And so it's just also crucial to be aware of potential sources of measurement bias when interpreting data, interpreting study results, and considering the generalizability of the findings. So an example of measurement bias is something called white coat hypertension. This is why we have the doctor here. Some patients may experience elevated blood pressure readings when measured in a clinical setting due to anxiety or stress to being in a medical environment. And so this can result in this systematic overestimation of the patient's true blood pressure and may lead to unnecessary treatment to reduce the measurement biases. And so to reduce these measurement biases, you can possibly do home-based measurements that provide more accurate representation of the patient's true blood pressure. Another example of measurement bias is weight measurements in nutritional studies. So self-reported weight and height data in surveys are often subject to measurement bias as participants. I think I've done this before, maybe underreported my weight or overreported my height due to social desirabilities or other factors. So what ends up happening is this can lead to underestimations of between weight and health outcomes. So in order to address this issue, researchers can use the objective measurements of weight and height or adjust statistical analysis for potential measurement biases. So this is probably my favorite bias here, and it's called sample bias, right? Sample bias occurs when the sample used in a study is not representative of the population being studied. This can happen in several ways, such as when the sample is too small, when the participants are not randomly selected, or when certain groups of people are underrepresented in the sample. Imagine trying to predict who will win an election by only asking your friends. It just doesn't work. And here's a famous example. So this real world example is about sample bias occurred during the 1936 United States presidential election, which pitted the incumbent Democrat FDR against a Republican F. Landon. And so there was a magazine at the time that was very popular called the Literary Digest. And they decided to conduct a poll to predict the outcome of the election. The poll sample size was 2 million people. This is by far the largest sample size ever used in a poll at that time. However, the poll had a very serious flaw. The sample was biased. The Literary Digest sent out their poll to their own subscriber list, as well as the owners of cars and telephones. And at this time, those were seen as signs of affluence. And so the poll excluded many poor people who couldn't afford these luxuries. And as a result, the poll showed that Alf Landon was likely to win the election in a landslide. But in reality, the election turned out quite differently. FDR won by a huge margin, carrying 46 of the 48 states. The Literary Digest prediction was so far off that they actually went bankrupt shortly afterwards. And this story illustrates how sample bias can lead to inaccurate predictions and flawed conclusions. In this case, the poll's results were biased in favor of one candidate because it excluded a large portion of the population that didn't have access to certain luxuries. Had the poll included a more representative sample, its predictions may have been more accurate. So selection bias, which is our next bias to discuss, is like a sibling to sample bias. Selection bias occurs when a selection of participants is not random, leading to a non-representative sample. This can happen when participants are self-selected or when they choose based on certain criteria. such as age or health status, leading to skewed or inaccurate results. So on your screen, we can see that the population is made up of 75% female, 25% male, but in the bias sample that is chosen, we've chosen that we have 5 males and 5 females, and this is not a great representation. This selection is not a great representation of the true population. So one real life story of selection bias occurs in a study of the effectiveness of this drug, tamoxifen, for preventing breast cancer. The study was called the Breast Cancer Prevention Trial and was conducted in the US in the 1990s and included over 13,000 women who were at high risk of developing breast cancer. However, the study suffered from selection bias as the participants were predominantly white, postmenopausal women, which made them unrepresentative of the broader population of women who might benefit from tamoxifen. The selection bias led to concerns about the generalizability of the study's finding and its potential impact on public health, right? The story highlights the importance of considering selection bias in research, particularly in medical studies where findings can be significant. Dr. Lisa Schwartz gave an interview, one of the researchers who analyzed the study's data gave an interview to NPR, and she said that it was really good study, but it only told us about the women who were in it. It didn't tell us about what it would do for other people. So let's think about selection bias and sample bias again. So imagine you have a big jar full of red and blue marbles. And sample bias is when you only grab the marbles from the top of the jar, which might have more red marbles in the whole jar. And selection bias is when you only pick marbles while wearing red tinted glasses, making you more likely to choose red marbles. And so both biases make your handful of marbles not representative of the whole jar accurately, right? So now we get to how to avoid cognitive and statistical biases. So how do we kick bias to the curb? To make better decisions and to do better research, we gotta be aware of our biases and blind spots. So that's education and awareness. We need to plan our studies carefully with randomization, blinding, and control groups. So that's research design. Collect data the right way. In collecting data using objective measurements, measurement tools and instruments. So that's data collection. So for data analysis, we need to analyze data smartly, keeping biases in mind, and use the appropriate statistical methods for data analysis. It's very important that we share our work and be open to criticism. So replication and transparency. But we need to stay skeptical and don't believe everything we read ourselves, right? So critical thinking and skepticism, right? We should work together with our peers so we get peer review and collaboration. And most important, I think over everything is that we need to keep learning and improving. So continuous learning and improvement. And that's all I have for you today. I'm more than happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gray. You exposed me to identification of being one of those people where I fill out the form, my height goes up by 1 inch and my weight goes down by 10 pounds. So
Yeah, I'm right there with you. So
I freely admit to that. We do have some great questions and comments. Again, I would encourage everyone to enter them. From Anne. Anne says, where is the line between confirmation bias and fraud?
Whew. So what ended up happening in these drug cases is the pharmaceutical companies really didn't have any issues. Policy was made in order to prevent it from happening. And so I myself, from an ethical standpoint, it's definitely fraud, but from the pharmaceutical standing with the actual, with the government standing, it just meant tighter restrictions on what you could and could not, what you had to report. So these changes did lead to significant policy changes, but I don't think the pharmaceutical companies, no one was prosecuted for them. So
here's a comment, and Francisco not only made a comment, but shared a resource, which I'll provide to you and everyone else has it. The comment is, observer bias can have repercussions for technology, like sensors that fail to detect darker skin tones. And then she points to, here's an article about one fascinating real world example. And again, let me add to that, with the world of AI, machine learning, facial recognition, what about built-in biases in AI, particularly when it comes to detecting different physical characteristics of people?
Yeah, this is important. So I just finished a project with Johns Hopkins on what we call skin toxicity. And so the study was simple. Were to take women that had radiation treatment on their breasts and look at the development of what's called skin toxicity, in which there would be drying of the skin, there would be other elements that would happen. And the doctor, they were comparing it, they had a technique of actually using a camera to take a picture at different days to see if the camera could pick up, using artificial intelligence, that they could pick up the sign of skin toxicity prior. What we found out was that in white females, this was okay. In lighter skinned people, it was okay. But once you get to darker skinned people, you could not determine the difference in this. And so we're also seeing, we have to be aware in our studies, because that was never, in the original studies, that was never pointed out that they would have a problem against the actual gradation of skin color. So it's very, very apparent that these types of things have not repercussions, but should be thought about a lot more when you're doing artificial intelligence.
Thank you. Another question from Kathy. Do you have any suggestions for working with survey or research partners, companies that recruit people to participate in these surveys? Are there resources or suggestions of expectations to communicate with it?
I actually do not have a response for that. A company that I would suggest that you work with is called Poll USA. They're very well-known survey company that has a great reputation for their surveys and their methodology. But more than that, I can't expand on.
And again, I welcome everyone. This is Knowledge at Noon from Georgetown University. Our conversation is with Dr. Lawrence Gray this afternoon. And we certainly encourage you to enter your questions or comments, and I will then give them to Dr. Gray for comment. One thing, as you know, Dr. Gray, every day we pick up the newspaper, everywhere, everyone has a very elevated concern about generative AI and the spread of misinformation. You made it very clear in your presentation, excuse me, that we need to be skeptical of anything that we see and read. We have elections coming up. So I would have two questions for you. What is your current concern for generative AI, generally good or bad? And second of all, can you give a little more advice how we can put our biases aside, keep that open mind, and be more skeptical in really determining what the truth is?
Yeah, This is hard. At work, we actually have once a week an ethics talk, and because this is the work that the area of work that we work in, and my answer to this is how we deal with this is to engage into ethical conversations about how things are being done. I don't think we really understand the repercussions of generative AI at this moment, because it's fascinating and people want to use it. But from our discussions, what we've noticed of what we decided to do is be mindful of the clients that we work with and the types of things that they develop. And so generative AI has been one of those areas that we've kind of stopped and decided not to work with people on at the moment, because we don't fully understand the ethics behind everything to fully make a decision. And ethics is a huge part of our values where I work. And so that's been our stance for generative AI. As far as being more skeptical, it comes from being aware. Like, one of the things that I have the pleasure of doing is to read about these new technologies all the time, right? And so I understand the limitations of them, their capabilities. And as a layperson, you might not have access to that or the understanding to be able to do that. But I encourage people to take it upon themselves to learn as much as possible about the technologies that they're deciding to use, in order so that as new things come to light, that they can actually have a wider view of the implementations of it or the ethical implementations of it.
Thank you very much for that answer. I find it reaffirming that the standard goes to ethics. Is it ethical? And if you don't understand the implications of the ethics around this new generative AI, it's you being very cautious. And I think that is a great comment for all of us to take heed of, is caution. Is that correct, Dr.
Yep.
Gray?
So one of the things that you mentioned about everything that's in the news right now, so I'm on a very interesting project, and it's an unclassified project, but there's general, since the past elections, there were a lot of disinformation campaigns going on. And they were really, and the evidence was shown that heavily they were targeted towards certain groups. They're targeted toward to incite racial tensions, and these are from big governments that are actually doing this. And so what we're doing right now is actually to help that, is doing this is particular on Twitter, doing bot detection, where there are actual non-human people that are spreading information and targeting groups, and we have the technology to detect that. And so we're working with the military at the moment to be able to detect this. So this is definitely real, and that you have to be skeptical of the information that you read, whether it be from the right or the left, that the information that you receive is actually not only just catering to, preformed biases that you hold, but is actually backed by evidence. And that becomes very, very important, because there are actors out there, bad actors, that will play upon that. And we see it in real life. So
thank you for that answer. We just have time for one or two more questions. Ozo has two questions for you. For research studies with biases identified in the design structure, how do we account for reliance? And I have to move. How do we account for reliance on the skewed information? And also, how are the findings evaluated on a go-forward basis?
So I'm going to repeat back what I think I heard. So you have biased data, and you want to continue the study. And how do you account for the skewed data that you have? I think there are two options here. And the one that no one wants to hear is to redo the study, but that is not always practical, right? No one wants to do that. The other one is to find statistical, and this goes back to whenever they were doing nutritional studies on weight, and you have over or under reporting of weight and height, and how they deal with that is there are statistical methods that take in the consideration that things are skewed, are being skewed in one direction or another, and you can apply those statistical methods. I don't know which ones offhand, but that's definitely a space. So you don't always have to start over, but there might be room there to actually apply some statistical methods that account for the skewness.
Would you have time to entertain one more question?
I have 18
Okay.
minutes. We can keep going.
Great. Question from Frederick. Will that strategy of not working with companies that are working in the field of generative AI put you at a disadvantage in building an understanding of the problems and your ability to fix them in the space with the speed that we're going in AI?
Yeah, so us deciding not to work with these companies at this point is limited by our understanding of the technology. And we will reassess this, right? Once we feel more comfortable with this. And I don't think it's we never think our ethics is something that's going to restrict us. So we have turned down work over and over again, based on our ethics and what we believe. So we do not do facial recognition work. Regardless, we still see that as a strong point for us to be competitive. And right now in generative AI, most people don't understand the business applications of generative AI fully yet. And so there's not a lot of business out there for people building generative AI type things other than like ChatGPT and things like that. So whenever I think of generative AI, I put that into two separate buckets. As far as there's the ethics of generating images and things like that, because there's ownership issues around that, who actually owns everything. And so with that, we have a project now that we work on that deals with music and how we actually credit artists to the music that's being generated. And we're working on that project, even though it's generative in nature, where they're creating music. But the reason we work with them is because they want to give appropriate attribution to the artist that the music is coming from. And so the ethical issue is not there as far as with other generative AIs. And ChatGPT, I don't think we really looked at that, but just because no one has really come forward to actually implement these large language models, because they require so much technical resources that we're not able to just build out. We're talking about millions of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars in order to build one of these like ChatGPT models that's for a company. Most companies aren't willing at this point to invest $100,000 unless they're a bigger company into this type of technology. So I don't foresee it as being, even at the pace that AI is moving, that we're at a disadvantage.
Thank you, Dr. Gray. I am sharing with everyone in attendance today. And as I said, we are so happy to have you join us from around the world and the United States today. The link I gave you is a link to the Professional Development and Certificates YouTube channel for Georgetown University. The recording of Dr. Gray's presentation will be available there within 24 hours, closed caption for your convenience. Dr. Gray of Kung Fu AI, Program Director in Data-Driven Decision Making and Data Analytics at Georgetown University. Thank you so much for joining us today. We greatly appreciate it. Our best wishes to you, and see you around campus.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone. Thank you.